Hi, I'm Spencer Christian. On this episode of Tracks Ahead, we'll take a ride on the Reading to discover the sights of Pennsylvania come to life in miniature. We'll take a 5-minute railroad trip between Tacoma and the Stampede Pass, and we'll head to eastern Oregon, where a dedicated group of volunteers is preserving the steam heritage of the gold fields. Now, if you're one of the millions of people who plan on visiting the Grand Canyon in the not-too-distant future, I'm sure you're aware of the breathtaking beauty that awaits you. But you might not know that there are a number of historic and opulent old railroad hotels nearby that are stunningly beautiful as well. Let's take a look.
Williams, Arizona is home to the historic Grand Canyon Railway. Established as a mining railroad more than 100 years ago, it soon evolved into a passenger train line and was reborn as a tourist railroad in the late 1980s. Once again, its mission is to carry visitors back and forth to the nearby Grand Canyon. For many years, visitors to Williams would stay in the old Fray Marcos Hotel, which now houses railway offices. When it opened in 1908, it was also called a Harvey House Hotel, one of the first of what would be many.
Well, the Fray Marcos Hotel was one of the original Harvey houses that were built in conjunction with the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company. Santa Fe built them, Fred Harvey managed them. And it was a very good relationship that lasted for a long period of time. The same situation existed here at the Fray Marcos and Williams as did at the Grand Canyon. All those hotels and facilities that were built at the South Rim were built by the railroad. All the facilities here in Williams dealing with the hotel and its support structure was built by the railroad. And Fred Harvey managed these hotels. Originally, when the railroads were running along the vast expanses of the West, they had to set up at regularly spaced intervals places where the trains could stop and the passengers could eat. They did not have onboard train service in the early days, so they had eating houses spaced regularly along the railroad. And the trains would stop, the passengers would deboard, they would go into the restaurant, feed, and in very short order they would be whistled back to the train and jump on board and go on to their destination. But a lot of them were, like the Fray Marcos here, is at a junction. Or at a destination, say like the El Tovar and the Bright Angel, they are at the Grand Canyon. But many of them were at junction points of the railway where the trains would come in, the people would deboard, get off and get on another train that would take them to their destination. So these were overnight stops when they became hotels.
The old Fray Marcos stands with the grace and dignity of an elder statesman, adjacent to a beautiful new Fray Marcos Hotel, also owned by the railroad. Visitors get 21st century amenities here. On board the trains of the Grand Canyon Railway, you take a 60-mile trip through the ponderosa pines of a national forest en route to Grand Canyon National Park. 277 miles long and up to 10 miles wide, the Grand Canyon is breathtaking. And on the edge of the southern rim, another hotel built by the railroad and run by Fred Harvey, an incredibly beautiful El Tovar.
Well, the hotel was commissioned by the Santa Fe Railroad in 1902, and construction actually began in late 1902 and was completed and opened in January the 14th, 1905. With the coming of the railroad here in September of 1901, folks were clamoring to visit, and we needed a nice place for nice folks, and the Santa Fe Railroad decided to have Charles Whittlesley, who was a noted architect at the time, design a hotel and build it up here. The odd thing being that the hotel was designed before anybody knew exactly where we were going to put it. Consequently, it's situated, one might say precariously, at the head of Garden Creek here. It looks Norwegian or Swedish or just European in general. It's beautiful, that's for sure. The logs that were used to face the hotel and the major ones on the inside all came from Oregon. And the Kaibab limestone, of course, is local. When the hotel was completed, remember this is 1905, it boasted telephones in every room. Some rooms even had bathrooms, not all of them, and it had what they then called electroliers, which was all the rage. It was probably the most luxurious hotel outside of, again, San Francisco in the West at the time.
Not far from the Grand Canyon, in Winslow, Arizona, you'll see another reminder of how important the railroad and railroad hotels were to the turn-of-the-century growth and development of the Southwest. La Pasada Hotel, described as Arizona's grandest estate, looks as elegant now as she did when she opened in 1930. It would be the last of the great Harvey hotels, and it too has undergone a renovation, restoration, and rejuvenation.
First and foremost, Mary Coulter designed it. It was her largest project and the one that was closest to her heart. And Mary Coulter was a woman architect, in the 1930s working for the railroad. This is unheard of. And she was essentially so good at what she did that by the time she was building this hotel, she had free reign. She was in her 60s when she was building this hotel. Coulter was ahead of her time in a number of ways, whereas most architecture engineers out here really didn't even think of the Southwest as having a culture. Coulter pretty much imbued every one of her buildings with the culture of the area. This building has a fictional history behind it. It's meant to be a grand hacienda for a wealthy Spanish family, a cattle baron. And that history is played out throughout the entire hotel. Even though the building was built in 1 year in 1930, it's designed to look like it evolved over 200 years.
La Pasada was another part of Fred Harvey's small empire, an empire which lasted until the 1950s. He was a man whose only mission was to provide rail travelers with the best hotels, best restaurants, and best waitresses they would find anywhere a train whistle blew. Waitresses, not waiters. They were called the Harvey Girls.
They were on time, they didn't drink, and they were hard workers. And so that was the beginning, the birth of the Harvey Girls. And then it went on to where they went back to Kansas City, Missouri, and put ads in the paper. Wanted young women 18 to 30 years old, of good character, no experience necessary, room and board provided. Their pay was $17.50 a month, and the tips were liberal. And that was the birth of the Harvey Girls.
Attractive and intelligent.
And intelligent.
Attractive and intelligent.
They taught me how to serve and what to serve and what not to do and what to do. And I learned many things from that.
Arizona is filled with natural beauty and man-made beauty. Reminders are everywhere that even when your primary mission is to explore the wonders of nature, it has long been the mission of the railroads to help you do it with comfort and style.
All of these hotels have been named to the U.S. Register of Historic Places. You can relax and watch trains at the same time. Now we're going to take a ride on the Reading to discover how Jerry Strangarity has made the sights of Pennsylvania come to life with his structure modeling.
Everyone thinks of model railroading differently. For some, it's about collecting specific engines and cars. For others, it's about recreating a particular moment in time. And for Jerry Strangarity, it's all about structure modeling. Jerry has been modeling since he was a kid growing up near the Reading Railroad in Pennsylvania.
He used a lot of Victorian architecture, a lot of gingerbread trim. In building models of structures like that, I find that it's challenging and it's a lot of fun to try and recreate that type of thing. And another thing I liked about the Reading Railroad was the type of land that it traversed. It went everywhere from the coal regions in upper Pennsylvania through the hilly areas, the farm areas, the urban areas like Reading, Pennsylvania, and down to Philadelphia where you had the waterfront. So you have a little bit of everything. And from a modeling standpoint for model railroading, there's a lot there to keep your interest.
Jerry's skills at modeling led him to create a version of downtown Philadelphia that's filled with details, both large and small. Since Philadelphia is the biggest city that the Reading services, it makes sense that it takes up such a large amount of Jerry's layout, with an area that's 16 feet long by 3 feet wide. To get there, Jerry's HO-scale Reading Railroad rides through a tunnel, passes the Texaco oil refinery, then commercial and residential areas, and finally, downtown. One of the most unusual buildings is this 2-deck ice plant that the railroad used for refrigeration cars. Jerry's still working on the Reading Terminal Passenger Station and its downtown setting. He likes to add lots of details to make his models look realistic, including barrels and piles of junk. Most of the buildings are scratch-built and based on real Philadelphia landmarks. Not many people can just look at a picture of a building and then model it without first making detailed plans. But Jerry does this all the time. He's modeled buildings after pictures in magazines, like this corner bar, or photographs he's taken himself, this classic Wagon Works building. He's even modeled a building based upon stories his grandfather told him.
Well, many years ago, I was talking to my grandfather about his early days working as a kid in Reading, Pennsylvania. And he was telling me he used to work at the Reading Company car shops. And he was describing the conditions that he worked under, dirt floors and long hours and that sort of thing. And I began to think that this would be neat to build a model of something like that. So I put all those ideas together in my head and drew up some plans and built a model.
But just because Jerry likes to focus on modeling doesn't mean he's ignored the railroad part of his model railroad. He hand-laid most of the layout's tracks and cut tens of thousands of ties. When it's completed, the layout will represent the Reading Railroad in the 1930s and 1940s. A fan of the steam era, Jerry has paid particular attention to the signals.
The signals, one at each end of the city, are modeled from actual Reading Company blueprints, and they're an odd sort of signal. They're called hall banjo signals, and they were used almost exclusively on the Reading. And the Reading used them even up into the 50s, so they were a common sight on the Reading, and when you see a banjo signal like that, it speaks Reading.
Some modelers might think even Jerry's modeling materials and techniques have a touch of nostalgia to them. Even though so many modelers have changed over to plastic and other man-made materials, Jerry still relies on good old-fashioned cardstock.
I have people that come here and see the layout, and I tell them I'm still using cardstock, and they look at me like I'm crazy. But then they're intrigued and want to know a lot more about it. Back in the 50s, cardstock was the mainstay of model building. In the days before styrene and other materials came on board. Cardstock is, well, for one thing, it's cheap. And when I started modeling, of course, I was a kid, and we didn't have a lot of money to go buy trains. So if I wanted something, I had to build it. And cardstock is also easy to work with. It's easy to cut window openings and so forth out with a knife. And it's just a versatile, easy material to work with.
Now that the Philadelphia modeling is almost complete, Jerry is looking forward to finishing up the rest of the layout. He's planning on creating a large area that will depict the Pennsylvania coal mining country.
I'm looking forward to that because I've been spending quite a few years building just city with lots of buildings, and now I want to build some mountains, so I think the coal regions will be my next project.
I don't know if you noticed the camelback locomotives on Jerry's layout. They were an unusual design and common to the Reading Railroad. In a minute, we'll visit a remnant of the Sumter Valley Railroad that ran from Prairie City to Baker City, Oregon, hauling first lumber and then gold. It ceased operation in 1947, but in 1971, a dedicated group of volunteers started to bring it back to life. First, let's go to Tacoma, Washington, and back to the 1950s. We'll take a trip between Tacoma and the Stampede Pass.
How would you like to take a train from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington? Or better yet, how about a trip through the spectacular mountains of southwestern Washington down to Tacoma? Don't have a lot of time? Oh, that's all right. The trip only takes a few minutes here on Level 5 of the Washington State History Museum in Tacoma. This is where the Puget Sound model railroad engineers have built an incredibly detailed HO gauge railroad reality from the 1950s.
Well, there is a trip between Portland and Seattle, but that's a small part of this. Our real trip is from Stampede Pass down through Tacoma up to the Asarco smelter. I think the thing that is most unique about it is that we are probably more authentic for the scale and what we have here than almost any other exhibit in the country. I think a lot of the fun part of it was to put it together in a nice condensed area that still represented the whole 90 miles from Stampede Pass into Tacoma, and to represent that as it was in the 1950s in a very authentic manner.
Begun in 1996, this unique project was built entirely by volunteers.
Our biggest challenge, I guess, was in finding the right kind of guys to do the right kind of work at the right kind of time. And we were very fortunate in doing that because we had an architect who could lay this out. We had a modeler who did the whole design scheme very well. And then we had a construction type fellow who did the basic work. We had a man with a lot of track experience to do track. We had a mechanical engineer who does our equipment work, and on down the line. So we have a specialist in each area. The museum purchases 4 trains, including all of the rolling stock, the engines and the cars and the cabooses. And then each member of our club must contribute 6 pieces of rolling stock, or they can contribute 1 engine in lieu of 3 pieces of rolling stock, and that must stay on the layout. If they have to repair it and take it home, they have to have a replacement here so that we have that on hand all the time.
A layout this complex certainly presents some control challenges. The club has overlooked no detail in creating a state-of-the-art digital control strategy that satisfies both the members and the visitors.
We control this for the general public with an automatic loop, so when people come in and push a button, 1 train starts, and when it clears a block, the 2nd train goes, and when it clears the 3rd, and then the 4th. And this is just automatic for the general public when none of us are here. When we're here operating, we use a Digitrack control system, and we have throttles so that we control these trains individually, and we also control them as they were in the 1950s on a 1950s schedule. We have a dispatcher who is in another room, and as each engineer is ready to roll his train, he calls in for clearance to clear the yard and to move. The dispatcher gives him that clearance and permission to go.
As we can see plainly, the aesthetics of this miniature marvel are rivaled only by the technology.
What's unique about this layout is the fact that we've taken full advantage of the Digitrack's technology here. Here's a control panel in one of the areas on the layout. What we've done is replace our existing control system control panels with a lot of wires on them down to a very simple panel like this with only 1 single loconet cable. And so I can demonstrate this by pressing a single button. The light on the control panel should blink, which means that a message is going out to the device. When the switch machine throws, it sends a message back, which stops the blinking, and that tells us that we've got a good switch throw.
And what's the bottom line for these hardworking volunteers?
We're here to build, maintain, and operate this layout for the general public, and particularly for the children, we like to think, and show them what the railroads did to service this area in the 1950s.
So if you ever find yourself actually on a trip between Portland and Seattle, take the time to stop off in Tacoma and visit the Washington State History Museum to see what the area really looked like by rail some 50 years ago.
It hardly seems possible. We almost have to pinch ourselves to remember we're still living in the 21st century. As we hitch a ride in the cab of this wood-burning steam locomotive, it almost seems like we've misplaced 100 years somewhere. But the fact is, today, we're riding on the Sumter Valley Railway through the mountains of eastern Oregon. This marvel of reconstructed history is headquartered about 26 miles southeast of Baker City on U.S. Highway 7. Maybe we can get some help solving our riddle from Taylor Rush, the railroad's head depot agent and historian.
Sumter Valley Railroad today is essentially the culmination of about 30 years' effort on the part of an almost entirely volunteer crew. It started in 1971 essentially with a group of concerned citizens who didn't want to see the railroad's history pretty much fade into oblivion. The railroad's been, I think, in full-time operation now. We're going on our 28th year, and it's just a labor of love. The purpose of the railroad is essentially to kind of take people back in time to see just what the used to be like, traveling through the 1920s through the 40s, you know, on the pretty much golden era of railroad travel and the full history of the area, from logging to mining and everything that made Sumter what it is.
But just what kind of history has been rebuilt here?
The original railroad was started in 1890 by David Eccles with essentially the purpose of bringing lumber to his Oregon Lumber Company sawmill in Baker City. It slowly built its way over the mountains, just following the timber lines as it went. And where we're standing now was actually the end of the line for quite a few years. In 1896, though, the gold mines around Sumter really opened up, and the railroad had pretty much an incentive to push forward into the hills, and that's when the big buildings started. They shoved on into Sumter and then went crazy after that, kind of. The railroad eventually stretched over 80 miles from Baker City to Prairie City, and there were over 1,600 miles of logging lines out in the woods that fed into the main trunk. The main purpose was lumber, but hauled just about everything else in between, from cattle to people to gold, machinery, oil, all that. If it could haul it, it would.
The restoration of this old workhorse of a railroad is a most amazing story. Although the roadbed and track is mostly on the railroad's original right-of-way, the original track had been scrapped in 1947, and nearly all of the original roadbed had eroded away. With an unbelievably dedicated, all-volunteer workforce, the Sumter Valley Railway has rebuilt over 7 miles of track and is still growing. And let's not forget the ongoing effort of restoring the trains themselves.
Just about anything you see here has been restored or is on the verge of restoration. One of our major ones right now, though, is Sumter Valley Caboose number 3. It's one of the only surviving cars from the original railroad and saw service not only on our line, but also on the White Pass and Yukon in Alaska. She was brought back in the early 90s, and restorations were started on it last year. Another one of our more interesting pieces would be Sumter Valley Coach number 20. She was built in 1880 for the Utah and Northern and was one of the original pieces ever acquired by the actual railroad in 1890. She saw service through about 1918 when she was set aside as a bunkhouse at Austin. She suffered a fire there and had just about every little bit of iron or interior work stripped out of it. And in 1947, when the railroad shut down, a private company actually bought it over in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, had it cut in half and shipped over there. In 1990, the surviving daughter of David Eccles, the original founder, Miss M. Eccles Jones, gave a very substantial donation for the restoration of the car, the acquisition and restoration. And in her honor, the coach was named after her. So the M. Eccles Jones, or number 20 as she's more commonly known, has been in service with the railroad since about 1992 and is 124 years and going strong.
And what lies ahead for this ongoing labor of love?
The future plans for Sumter Valley include actually, and we're in the process right now, of a 5-mile extension down to the Union Creek Campground to Phillips Reservoir, which will just about double our mainline trackage. We've built a brand new depot up in Sumter, and right now the tracks are being built towards it. Still have a few hundred feet to go. It kind of got built in reverse. Usually it's tracks first, then depot, but we did it the other way. And we have a loop track going in. We've got the restoration number 20 is planned. We've got new coaches online, new engines. We've got a lot of ambitious projects. You know, we're not sure if we're going to get to do them all, but if you ever rationalize something, you'll never get done.
Over a quarter century since the restoration's humble beginnings, the Sumter Valley Railroad is alive and well. The ever-growing collection of railway artifacts encompasses a large part of this country's narrow-gauge past, with cars from as far away as Pennsylvania and Alaska. So our feeling of being lost in time is not without cause, and would not have been possible without the dedication of the intrepid crew of Sumter Valley Volunteers.
If you visit the club and the Washington State Historical Society, be sure to also visit the Chihuly Glass Works, which is right across the street. Well, that's all for this episode. Be sure to join us next time for more Tracks Ahead.